The date is January 30th, 1945. The Baltic Sea is frozen, pitch black, and running at -18 degrees Celsius. On board the MV Wilhelm Gustloff, more than 10,000 people are packed into every corridor, every stairwell, every lifeboat deck. Most of them are women. Most of them are children. They are German civilians fleeing the Soviet advance from East Prussia, running from the Red Army that is burning everything behind it. They were told the ship was safe. They were told the Baltic was guarded. Nobody told them about Alexander Marinesko. Here is what pop history does with a story like this. It either ignores it entirely, or it frames it as a clean military victory. A Soviet submarine sank a Nazi ship. End of story. But the raw data tells a completely different story, one that exposes the catastrophic operational failures on both sides, the civilian cost of military panic, and why the worst maritime disaster in human history has been systematically buried for 80 years. We are going to do a full battlefield autopsy on the night the Wilhelm Gustloff went under. Let's start with the ship itself, because the logistics of this vessel are the first layer of failure. The Wilhelm Gustloff was never designed for this. It was a cruise ship, built in 1937 as part of Hitler's Kraft durch Freude program, the Strength Through Joy initiative that was supposed to give ordinary German workers access to leisure travel. The ship had a certified capacity of around 1,900 people. On the night of January 30th, 1945, it was carrying somewhere between 10,000 and 10,600. The exact number has never been confirmed. The records were incomplete. The boarding process was chaos. Nobody was counting with any real accuracy, because nobody expected to survive what was coming next. Now let's talk about Alexander Marinesko, because this is where the story gets genuinely complicated. The Soviet commander of submarine S-13 was, by any objective standard, one of the most gifted submarine hunters of the entire war. He was also, by his own Navy's assessment, a severe disciplinary problem. In December 1944, just weeks before the Gustloff mission, Marinesko had gone absent without leave in Finland, apparently disappearing into a series of bars and a relationship with a local woman. His commanding officers were preparing court-martial proceedings against him. His naval career was essentially over. He was given one last chance to redeem himself. Take S-13 on patrol in the Baltic and sink something significant. He sank something significant. What followed on the night of January 30th was not a clean tactical engagement. It was a collision between two colossal failures, one on each side of the war, compressed into a single night. The German evacuation of East Prussia, codenamed Operation Hannibal, was the largest naval evacuation in history. Over 2 million people were moved by sea between January and May 1945. That is a logistical achievement of staggering scale, and it is almost entirely absent from Western histories of the war. The reason is uncomfortable. Those 2 million people were German civilians, and the dominant post-war narrative had very little appetite for German suffering, even civilian suffering, even suffering inflicted on women and children running from a collapsing front. The Wilhelm Gustloff was part of this evacuation. It had left Gdynia in occupied Poland on the afternoon of January 30th. The sea state was severe, the temperature was murderous, the ship was dangerously overloaded, and then the command decisions began piling up. Naval Captain Wilhelm Zahn, one of 3 officers on the bridge with competing authority, pushed for the ship to travel without an escort and hug the coastline where the water was shallow enough to prevent submarine attacks. He was overruled. The ship instead sailed a deeper, more exposed route with a single escort, a torpedo boat that had mechanical problems and was struggling to keep up. The anti-submarine zigzag pattern, standard doctrine for avoiding submarines in hostile waters, was turned off. The reasoning was that it slowed the ship down in rough seas. And so the Wilhelm Gustloff traveled in a straight line, at a predictable speed, on a predictable heading, with its running lights partially on to avoid collisions with ice, broadcasting its position across the dark Baltic to anyone who cared to look. Marinesko cared to look. S-13 had been tracking the ship for nearly 2 hours before it fired. Marinesko had identified the vessel, confirmed it was a large target, and made the decision to attack from the surface, running parallel to the Gustloff on its port side. This was unusual. Most submarine commanders preferred the protection of depth, but the shallow coastal waters limited his ability to submerge safely, and the surface approach gave him speed and a stable firing platform. At 21:04 local time, S-13 fired 3 torpedoes in sequence. The first torpedo was stenciled with the words, "For the Motherland." The second read, "For the Soviet people." The third read, "For Leningrad." All 3 hit. The first torpedo struck the bow, detonating in a compartment where a group of female naval auxiliaries were sleeping. The second hit the empty swimming pool area amidships. The third struck the engine room. The ship lost power almost immediately. The lights went out. The heating system failed. The intercom failed. And on a ship carrying 10,000 people, in darkness, in freezing temperatures, with lifeboats designed for fewer than 2,000, the situation became unsurvivable within minutes. Here is the operational reality that the Hollywood version never shows you. Of the roughly 22 lifeboats on the Gustloff, most could not be launched. The ship had taken on a severe list to port almost immediately after the torpedo impacts. Gravity and ice made the starboard lifeboats impossible to lower. The portside boats swung inward against the hull and were useless. Many of the life jackets stored on board were old, improperly maintained, and failed to keep people afloat in the churning, freezing water. Children who were dressed in life jackets and thrown into the sea were found floating face down. The jackets were so buoyant at the shoulder that they flipped small bodies upside down. This is not dramatic flourish. This is from the survivor testimony and the post-war logistics investigations. The Gustloff sank in approximately 45 minutes, but the killing did not stop when the ship went under. The water temperature was -2 degrees Celsius at the surface. In those conditions, hypothermia sets in within minutes. Unconsciousness follows within 30 minutes. Death follows shortly after. The rescue ships that arrived, several torpedo boats and a few other vessels, were pulling corpses from the water hours after the sinking. Of the approximately 10,000 to 10,600 people on board, fewer than 1,200 survived. The conservative death toll is 9,400 people. Some estimates go higher. For comparison, the Titanic killed 1,517. The Gustloff killed more than 6 times that number, and almost nobody in the Western world knows its name. Why? Because the story was buried by both sides. The Soviet Union officially celebrated Marinesco's attack, but suppressed the full scale of the civilian casualty toll, which complicated the clean narrative of a military strike against an enemy vessel. The German government in the post-war years had obvious reasons to avoid dwelling on German suffering when the country was processing the scale of its own crimes. And the Western Allies had no particular interest in publicizing the mass death of German civilians at a time when the political architecture of post-war Europe was being constructed around a clear moral framework of Allied liberation and Axis guilt. The Gustloff sinking was inconvenient for everyone's story, so it was quietly filed away. Marinesco never received the Hero of the Soviet Union designation he expected. His disciplinary record weighed against him. He was demoted in 1945, arrested on theft charges in 1949, spent 3 years in a labor camp, and died in 1963 in poverty. The Soviet state rehabilitated him posthumously in 1990, awarding him the Hero of the Soviet Union title 27 years after his death. By then, he was not available to appreciate the irony. The German survivors of the Gustloff spent decades in a kind of public silence. For much of the post-war period, German civilian victims of the war were not a subject that German public discourse was equipped to process. The acknowledged guilt of the Nazi state made any expression of German suffering politically and morally complicated. It was not until Günter Grass published his 2002 novella, Crab Walk, that the Gustloff sinking entered mainstream German cultural consciousness in any significant way, nearly 60 years after the fact. What the logistics of this disaster actually reveal is a complete systemic breakdown on the German side that goes far beyond a single command decision on a single night. Operation Hannibal was improvised under extreme pressure. The evacuation of East Prussia began in earnest only when it was almost too late, delayed by Hitler's explicit orders forbidding the retreat that would have allowed an orderly civilian evacuation weeks earlier. By the time the Wehrmacht was finally authorized to fall back and the Navy began organizing sea transport, the Soviets were already within artillery range of the ports. Ships were loaded past any rational capacity because there was no alternative. The infrastructure for processing, documenting, and safely boarding that many people simply did not exist. The Wilhelm Gustloff was a symptom of a military and political system that had consumed its own margins of safety years before January 1945. Marinesco's 3 torpedoes did not cause this disaster. They triggered it. The disaster had been building since the first strategic miscalculations of the Eastern Front, since the decision to tie up civilian populations in a military theater with no realistic evacuation plan, since the command culture that made it impossible to tell Hitler that the war on the Eastern Front was lost until the Red Army was burning cities. The torpedoes were the final audit on years of catastrophic operational reality. 9,400 people died in the Baltic Sea on the night of January 30th, 1945. Most of them were women and children. Most of them drowned or froze within an hour of the first explosion. The ship they were on was never designed to carry them. The route it took was never safe. The escort that was supposed to protect it was barely functional. And the man who sank it was technically facing court-martial at the time. This is what happens when you strip the romance out of military history and read the supply chain reports and the logistical assessments and the after-action reviews. You do not find heroic narratives and clean victories. You find systems failing, margins collapsing, and the people at the bottom of the command structure paying the price for decisions made at the top. The Wilhelm Gustloff is not a story about one torpedo and one submarine and one night in the Baltic. It is a story about what total war actually looks like when the operational planning runs out, and all that is left is the cold water and the dark.